I thought I would start with one, sort of thought or theme, which I would describe as the enemy of our enemy can be our tactical friend under circumstances like we have today. And of course, our enemy is the deep state, the empire abroad, this crazy interventionist policy that we've had over the last 20 or 30 years, but especially what is being driven now by a neocon view of the world, which is really just insane, and we can talk a little more about that later. And the Leviathan state we have at home, this gigantic government, but particularly as it has been enabled and driven by a central bank that is totally out of control and has basically taken the sting out of deficit finance. And I make this point because when I started as a congressman in 1976, and then Ron Paul came in 1978, and I can remember conversations about how bad the deficit was then, and you can't imagine, it was $45 billion, and we were scared to death. But the one thing that's different today, and that goes to the heart of what one of the things we're up against, is that at least back then you had a quasi-honest central bank. As you can remember, Paul Volcker was the chairman. He was not about to indulge or enable massive speculation and bubbles. And when inflation got out of hand after the 1978 oil crisis, he put his foot to the brake pretty dramatically, and did not allow the Federal Reserve and the central bank to monetize the big deficits that Jimmy Carter had generated and left on Reagan's doorstep. Now, the reason I say that is because in the days that you had quasi-honest monetary policy, and of course after Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, it really wasn't honest anymore. You were on a quasi-fiat standard, but at least in the early years, the people at the central bank kind of believed in sound money. They didn't know how much power they really had. They didn't know how far they could go, and they had beliefs instilled over decades and decades during an era that we were actually on, the Bretton Woods gold exchange standard, or some of them could even remember life in the 1920s and before 1914 when we didn't even have a central bank. The point is, they were not willing to just open up the spigot and buy in government debt hand over fist. And as a result of that, you did tend to get what I call the crowding out effect. The bigger the deficit got, the higher interest rates rose. Interest rates rose. When we went into office in early 1981, the 10-year bond was at 16%, if you can imagine anything like that today. That had the effect of crowding out private investment in the housing market for households, but especially in the banking market, in the business market, and it created a countervailing political interest. Small businessmen, big corporations, people that wanted to take out a mortgage and buy a home, all were on the side of let's get those interest rates down, let's get that deficit under control, let's get Uncle Sam out of the financial market so that we can compete fairly for the dollars. That's how it was then. Now, the other thing then, in 1987, unfortunately, people around Ronald Reagan, and he had supported, by the way, Volcker all the way through, people around Ronald Reagan convinced him that Volcker really was out to undermine the administration and he needed to go. What they really didn't like was that he was totally independent and that he was determined to keep the dollar reasonably sound, inflation low, and let the private economy go where it wanted to go based on what was happening in the real market for capitalism all around the country. So they basically forced him out, and they had the wonderful idea, let's put in Alan Greenspan. After all, he was part of Ayn Rand's crowd in New York. He had written some fabulous pieces. Some of you have read it, this great thing he wrote in 1966 about the virtues of the gold standard, and that was the only thing that basically kept government from expanding to the kind of girth that it has today, and the only thing that really kept deficit finance under control. Well, it turns out that over the years, Alan Greenspan had become a somewhat defrocked gold bug, and Reagan didn't understand that, but the reason I'm mentioning all this is that once Greenspan got in office, we had the big 20% meltdown in October 1987, as some of you can remember. It was off to the races because he discovered the printing press in the basement of the Eccles building where the Fed is housed. Now, obviously, Greenspan knew all about the printing press, but in the panic of a 20% drop in the stock market, literally overnight, they opened up the spigot. The crisis was relieved fairly quickly, and suddenly we were into a new era of what I call monetary central planning. They simply moved the Keynesian model, the Keynesian policy idea from the fiscal side, which was difficult to implement because you had all of these difficult congressmen not ever wanting to agree on anything, to the monetary side, to the central bank, where 12 members of an unelected Politburo could decide when, where, how, and how much to do. And at that point, they were off to the races, and you began this process of massive monetization of the federal debt. That had the effect of removing the crowding out effect, the rising interest effect, the interest rate signaling to the political system and to Capitol Hill that you needed to manage your fiscal accounts. All that was removed, and so you've had 30 years, basically, of a runaway fiscal process on Capitol Hill because there was no longer that restraint from the bond market, and you've had this enormous engorgement of the central banks. Now, I bring this up because in 1987, when Greenspan leapt off into this crazy new direction, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was $200 billion. And it had taken 78 years, more or less, from when the Fed opened for business in 1914, by year by year, a little bit by little bit, this kind of Ohio State offense, 2 yards in a cloud of dust. The Fed's balance sheet had crept forward because during that period, for the most part, you had reasonably good stewards running a central bank that had the inherent potential to get out of control. When it was linked to the gold, that held them back. When they had kind of human directors who were nearly as good as gold, like Volcker or William McChesney Martin, for the most part, that held them back. So it took 78 years to build the first $200 billion. By the time Alan Greenspan left his term 19 years later, it was nearly $800 billion. Then we had the great financial crisis of 2008, and some of you can remember that period pretty well. It is very much like today, and that's why I'm bringing it up. There was a presidential campaign on, and all the Republicans were running around in this primary saying, don't we have a glorious economy? We're in the midst of this Goldilocks perfection because we and the fiscal side and the Fed over with Greenspan and then his successor Bernanke have done such a wonderful job of implementing the great moderation. Everything is perfect. The business cycle has been extinguished, and it's onward and upward, full employment nirvana as far as the eye can see. There was only one candidate who said, this isn't reality, this is a bubble. He happens to be sitting right here, Ron Paul. He was right then. And we're kind of there now, and we'll get to some of that in a moment, where you have Donald Trump, who ran against the failure of the Obama and predecessor economies, who called the Wall Street at that time, when the stock market was about 2,100, a big, fat, ugly bubble waiting to collapse, who's now in office, has embraced the whole thing, singing the glories of the greatest economy since 2008. And we're roughly in the same point. But the point that I want to get across is that Trump is essentially merely the enemy of our enemy. All of that I've just described, and we haven't even gone into this out of control interventionist foreign policy that has basically destroyed the Middle East, is bankrupting the country, and has basically sullied the good name of America all around the globe. The point is, he's the enemy of our enemy that has done all that, and he has no redeeming qualities that I can think of, but there is a silver lining in what's happening in this whole crazy Trump era upside down world that we are living in at the moment. And I want to tick off a couple of those, and then we can open it up for any discussion you would like to have. But the first point is that he's discredited enormously the imperial presidency. And I think that is a wonderful thing, because partly the reason why our foreign policy has been so interventionist, has been so destructive, been so costly, has been such a big failure, is that an unelected group around the presidency in what we now call the deep state, the National Security Council, all of the 17 different intelligence agencies deep in the bowels of the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy, to say nothing of the Pentagon, and the military-industrial complex, and all the NGOs and all the think tanks. I mean, there's literally dozens and dozens of think tanks who live one way or another off government money through the back door or foundation money that's in the business of promoting the empire, promoting the neocon view of the world, promoting our intervention everywhere from the Idlib province in Syria to we're still, in North Korea 68 years after the war shouldn't have started in 1950. So the point is that the imperial presidency is at the heart of that. I mean, as a lot of you know, and as we all write about in our different publications all the time, we haven't had a proper war declared since, Pearl Harbor. And the fact is that if presidents had to go to Congress to get funding for the war and get a declaration of war, half of these interventions that we've been involved in, I wouldn't say half, I'd say 98% of them, never would have happened. And we had a good example of that not too long ago, which kind of set up the mess that we're in with Russia and Putin today. So I want to digress a little bit and mention that, because in that particular case, the imperial presidency was occupied at that point by Barack Obama. He had put out this stupid red line which said, we don't really know what's going on in Syria, but if somebody uses chemical weapons, that's the red line. We're coming in, whether you had any proof that Assad did it or some of our so-called allies and free rebels did it, or the jihadists that the Saudis were supporting. It didn't matter. He drew the red line. The attack happened in Ghouta, I believe it was, in August 2013. And the next thing you knew, Obama was called on his red line. And he hesitated first when the British refused to join, and then secondly, he kind of decided to throw the ball to Congress, asked them for a resolution of support. It never happened, and that gave Putin a wonderful opportunity to step in and say, we can cool down this situation by convincing Assad to give up his chemical weapons, remove the cause for war, remove the cause for the red line, and hopefully bring some sanity back to the situation. Well, that's exactly what happened. And as a result, we had a more sensible policy for the moment, except the neocons and the whole military foreign policy establishment were outraged that they were on the verge of regime change in Syria, which they desperately wanted. That was on the list. We'd already had it by that point in time, obviously, in Iraq. We had it in Libya. Syria was next. And Putin deftly stepped in and removed the cause for a war. So 6 months later, the uprising begins on the streets of Kiev, the so-called Maidan uprising. And the next thing we know, all the neocon politicians from McCain and all the rest of them, to the State Department and the local ambassador and the National Endowment for Democracy and operatives of the CIA posing as State Department personnel and so forth, were all over the place fomenting the coup, financing the coup, and recognizing immediately, within hours, a government that was formed out of a lot of nationalist Ukrainians and even some neo-Nazi elements that was as illegitimate as you can possibly imagine, but it was recognized, and that set off this whole demonization of Russia and Putin, because obviously they had to respond. And the reason they had to respond is it's on their doorstep. It's like if there was some kind of uprising that occurred, on the border of Arizona or New Mexico. And particularly, I just want to mention the craziness that developed with regard to the so-called annexation of Crimea. Because that is what has triggered this whole range of sanctions and this whole rapidly escalating Cold War 2.0 between Russia and the United States. And when you listen to the Washington Pals and policymakers and the neocons, it's as if, Putin were some kind of latter-day Hitler on the move, taking territory. And here's the ironic part. There is nary a Ukrainian-speaking person in Crimea, because Crimea was never part of the Ukraine. Crimea was always Russian. It was purchased for good money in 1783 by Catherine the Great from the Turks, who were always bankrupt and always needing money. It became an integral part of the Mother Russia in the era of the Tsars. Their great fleet, Black Sea Fleet, was home ported in Sevastopol, right on the peninsula. In fact, everybody here has probably read The Charge of the Light Brigade, the great Tennyson poem that occurred on Crimea when the invaders were coming. Well, who were the invaders? What was the English, the French, and the Turks, and who were the defenders? The Russians. That was the great patriotic moment in Russian history. So the point is, it never was part of Russia until 1954. The Soviet Union was in its midlife. The succession struggle happened after Stalin fortunately passed from this life. And Khrushchev won the struggle, as all of you remember, liquidated his enemies. And by the way, there's this great funny movie out now that you might want to look at, with making fun of the Russian succession at that time. I'll think of the name in a moment and pass it on to you. But anyway, as a reward for his allies who helped him liquidate his two opponents, Beria, who ran the KGB, and a second opponent, he awarded the Ukrainian comrades who had helped him by having the Presidium pass a decree moving Crimea from the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia to the Soviet Socialist Republic of the Ukraine. So that's how it became part of the Ukraine. The Presidium ordered it. And so here we are 70 years later saying the essence of our foreign policy is to enforce the writ of the dead hand of the Soviet Presidium from 1954. Okay, so that just gives you some feel for how far this whole empire has gotten out of control. And it's all happened. All of this policy maneuvering has all happened because of the imperial presidency and too much power in the Oval Office. And for whatever you may say about Trump's characteristics, and his character is bombastic and uncouth and unpleasant and so forth as he is making the imperial presidency look bad around the world. And frankly, I think that's a good thing, because next time we declare a war, maybe no one will come, because who wants to be part of that? And really, that's a little bit facetious, but it's actually true. People are now starting to think around the world about their own interests rather than being just robotic adherence to the Western Alliance or to NATO or whatever. Clearly, the Germans are going their own way. There's several countries in Eastern Europe, particularly Hungary, and now Italy and others. And this is all a good thing because we don't need an empire. We are not appointed to be the policeman of the world. We can't afford it. We're going bankrupt doing it. And everything we've tried has failed and has been a shambles anyway, from one side of the Middle East to the other. So that's the first thing he's doing. Second thing, he's discrediting the spy state. And I think that's a good thing because the Republicans were so in the tank for that whole apparatus of 17 so-called intelligence agencies and had given them so much money that they really were out of control. Here's a statistic that I think is pretty shocking, but indicates sort of the magnitude of why this is a problem. The combined budget of the 17 so-called intelligence agencies, and that includes the CIA, the DIA, the FBI, and all the other acronyms. Every department has some kind of intelligence operation or more than one, is $75 billion. Now that's a pretty staggering number because it actually exceeds the entire defense budget of Russia, which is $60 billion. And when you think about it, that $60 billion has to pay for the fuel, the pay of their armed forces, the boots, the ammunition, the planes, the ships, the whole ball of wax. They spend $60 billion on. We, of course, spend $720 billion. But we spend more on our intelligence agencies than the entire budget of the alleged reason why we have to have such a massive national defense program anyway. So what has happened here is that the intelligence community got over its skis, led by Brennan, right in the cusp, former CIA director, right in the cusp of the 2016 election, when Trump, I don't think Trump really has any foreign policy views. I mean, I wrote a book, some of you had my book, and I said Trump's better than the alternative, and we can all appreciate that. And he did have sort of a notion that maybe we were overextended, maybe we didn't need to be meddling and intervening everywhere, but it was a pretty superficial, top-of-the-head view, but at least he had enough strategic sense to say, why are we having this confrontation with Russia, with Putin? I mean, I think Trump up there had an epiphany up there in Trump Tower as he looked out. He said, my God, I can see Russia from here. And unlike Sarah Palin, who could see the landmass of Eurasia from Anchorage or somewhere, he actually could. Because what I'm talking about is the GDP of New York metro area, which you can see from his lair in Trump Tower, is 1.6 trillion. And the GDP of Russia is 1.4 trillion. In other words, the GDP of New York is bigger, and we're supposed to be shivering in our boots that Russia is some kind of existential threat to national security, that we need this massive defense budget, number one, but more importantly, this confrontation. Trump, the real estate developer and con artist, said, "Hey, maybe that doesn't sound right to me. And he has, overweening confidence in his ability to convince people of things. Thought, well, maybe I can convince Putin that we can settle differences and work together and reduce, the conflict in the world and the cost of all this." He was right about that, and the whole deep state went nuts. And that's why they unleashed this whole FBI-based, CIA, Brennan top office-driven, meddling in the campaign. So it's turning out. I think it's absolutely clear now, and all these great documents are now going to finally be declassified, and everybody's going to see them, that the only meddling that occurred in the 2016 election was the meddling by our own deep state, top-level national security operations designed to do whatever they could to undermine Trump's candidacy and promote the establishment designee. And this is all going to come out. And the reason I think this is so important and so good is that it's become a partisan issue. So now all of these Republican robots who would always line up and say, how much more do you need, CIA? How much more do you need, DIA? Are suddenly realizing that these are dangerous, vast mechanisms with great resources that can be turned against them politically, to say nothing of the larger issue of how do you run a constitutional democracy if the government is undermining its own elections. So I think this is a huge thing. I don't know exactly how it'll come out. I'm really confident now that Mueller is going to be a total big nothing burger, an embarrassment. I write about this stuff a lot in my blog, but and without getting bogged down in it too much, it's just the level of trivia that the other side has come up with in order to support its increasingly thin case is undermining the whole idea that we need 75 billion and this massive shield of secrecy and all this classification and so forth. When you find out what they're doing behind the screens, it's sort of like the Wizard of Oz. You find out that there's some little wheezing guy back there that isn't scary at all. And you know, you're going to find out now that this meeting at Trump Tower, you know, this was really some kind of seminal event, as the other side is claiming, that shows the nefarious intention of the Russians and operations of trying to collude with the Trump campaign. Well, you know, just look at the facts. The person that Putin allegedly sent was, a 29-year-old lawyer who didn't speak English. Okay, and you're going to send that kind of agent, that kind of secret agent to Trump Tower right then and there in the heat of a presidential campaign to make a deal on how it had nothing to do with the election. She was there for a good mission, which was lobbying against this Magnitsky Act, which is another whole story. Sometime if we ever have time, go into that. That's a real crock. That is partly behind all this tension that's been created. But anyway, the so-called Trump Tower meeting is a joke, all right? And the people in the Trump campaign who were allegedly being recruited by the Russians were such low-level wannabe volunteers in the campaign that they never even met Trump. You know, Carter Page never met him. Carter Page was just a guy trying to make a living and get a little visibility for himself. And here, after all this time, he's still not indicted because, one, there wasn't any collusion, and second, still that they were able to get FISA warrants from this system that we say has been so well honed and so carefully structured to protect the Constitution while enabling security operations that need to be done. If that is true, and that's the image, that Washington wants you to believe, the deep state keeps raising up. If it was that well choreographed and that well crafted, how in the world did they come up with this nonsense that they put before the FISA judge and get a warrant to surveil a low-level guy in a presidential campaign where they had, zero probable cause in any reasonable reading of the information. Now that is an alarming thing, and the reason I'm bringing this up is not to, get us all worked up about how dangerous the deep state is. We already know that. What it's done is opened the eyes of Republican politicians on Capitol Hill to how far this thing has gotten out of hand. And we're just beginning to see the beginning of it now. I think there are going to be hearings, there's going to be exposure. Hopefully there'll be some reform. Hopefully there'll be some curtailment of this great spy state, we call it surveillance state, and some reduction in these massive resources they have. But the biggest thing going on is, I think, bubble finance is being discredited. And that's because you can look at Trump's program and it goes from bad to awful, okay? You can start with the idea that we have a big trade problem, which we do. and it's caused by bad trade deals, which it isn't. It's caused by bad money, and if he wanted to solve the problem, he would go after the source of it a few blocks down the street in the Eccles building. But so the first thing is we're going to have a trade war, which is going to really devastate the whole international system based on central banking. And that will actually be painful in the short run, but positive in the longer run. The second thing is, if I had to boil it down to two words, his policy is fiscal debauchery. I mean, we've never seen anything like this, even from Democrats, in terms of this massive tax bill. I know everybody likes it, but in the 10th year of a recovery, when you already have a built-in deficit that's running at 3 or 4% of GDP, you don't lay on top of that a tax cut that is poorly designed and is basically going to go to stock buybacks anyway, without offsetting cuts in spending in order to bring this deficit under control. We can spend a huge amount of time on where we're going, but I'll tell you, it is in a very bad place, because built in when Trump started for the next 10 years was about 10 trillion worth of deficits. He's already added 4 trillion more through the tax bill and through all of these huge increases for the Pentagon. And then to get the Pentagon increases, they had to give all the pork barrel politicians their side. So they got 80 billion for defense, cost them 60 billion more for a domestic pork barrel of one type or another. And all the while there was a conspiracy not to say boo about the entitlements, which are $2.5 trillion a year, and nothing is being done. So the reason I bring this up is no one has abolished the business cycle. They didn't pass a law saying the business cycle is hereby extinguished. We are now in month 111 of this so-called expansion. It's the second longest in history, the weakest. The longest was 119 months. That was in the 1990s, when there's a lot more tailwinds and far fewer headwinds than we face today. So the idea, and this is the core of why there's a fantastic fiscal calamity coming, the idea that's built into the CBO projections and all the other 10-year budget projections you look at is that we're going to go to 2028 without another recession, which would mean that totally there would be 232 months of consecutive expansion between now and then, and it's never happened in human history. It's 3 times the normal business cycle, is double the longest one in history, and it doesn't take into account all the things that are going on around the world that are difficult, and to say nothing of the size of our deficit. Now, why that's important is that if you actually take the CBO economic forecast and strip out the rosy scenario, and that is interest rates that are way too low because we're going to get a yield shock in the market, and you factor in a reasonable business cycle, you're going to have a recession sometime in the 1920s. That adds another 5 trillion because you have the revenue loss and all the other impacts to the budget. So to boil it down without getting lost in numbers here, I'm absolutely convinced that we're going into the next 10 years, the 2020s, with built-in 20 trillion of new deficits. 10 years, 20 trillion, 2 trillion a year average. That'll take the national debt from 21 today to 41 some by 2028, to 145% of GDP, a non-viable situation in an economy that's gotten old. The baby boom will be entirely retired by then, or nearly retired. There's 50 million people over 65 today, of which some of us here are part of that group. I'll volunteer to be part of that. But there will be 100 million people over 65 3 decades from now. So you have this massive demographic wave coming that will suck the welfare state dry, and that's what you're heading into. And the worst thing you could possibly do is sort of add to the structural deficit right now and expect to get through that period. You won't. I mean, the whole thing is going to come undone. Now, in the short run, the Keynesians, who are still in charge of the Fed, are patting themselves on the back because just like in 2008, when Ron Paul said, this is a bubble, this isn't prosperity, they think they've created the be-all and end-all of prosperity, 3.8% unemployment, 1/4 of 4% GDP growth, so what? They come and go. The average has been terrible. But they think they've created a strong, solid, nearly perfect economy, and so therefore now they're ready to plow ahead and normalize interest rates, as they call it, and shrink the balance sheet of the Fed. Now, we know how crazy this was. As I said, it went from $200 billion to $4.5 trillion in less than 30 years, so that's a 22-fold increase. They're now finally going to roll that back. The reason I bring this up is that I believe they will do that until finally the whole system comes undone. Something big and nasty bursts on Wall Street, and by then it will be too late. So think about what's going to be coming down the pike then. In the year ahead, thanks to the fiscal debauchery out of Washington from the Trump Republicans and what was already built in from both parties, and the welfare state and the warfare state, and so on, and lay that against what the Fed is doing. And there you have the collision, the mother of all financial collisions, because the U.S. Treasury, starting October 1, which isn't that far from now, will have to borrow $1.2 trillion next year. And that's about the biggest ever, but it's in year 11 of a recovery. Not year 1 or at the bottom of a recession when private credit demand is at low levels and so forth. Nothing like it has ever happened. You know, when we were in year 11 of the only other business expansion of this length, which was, as I say, the 1990s, it was the spring of 2000. The budget was in 2% of GDP surplus. The Federal Reserve still had basically an untapped balance sheet. It was a totally different environment. Here we are today, and we're going to be borrowing 6% of GDP, $1.2 trillion. But here's the punchline. The Federal Reserve finally is going to be shrinking its balance sheet under what they call QT, quantitative tightening, by $600 billion per year annual rate. So if you do kind of the elementary math, the elementary addition, you're going to have $1.8 trillion of new or existing debt that the Fed and the Treasury will be dumping into the bond pits to see where it's all going to be absorbed. And it will be absorbed. The market's always clear. But it's going to clear, in my view, at a much higher rate than the rates that exist today. And they're already moving up quite strongly at the front end of the curve, and they will be towards the middle and back very soon. You know, the 10-year's already pushing 3.1%, and it'll be over that shortly. But more importantly, the front end of the curve is just soaring. You know, the 90-day Treasury bill during this whole period of massive money printing and so-called financial repression was down on the zero bound, as they call it, pinned to the floor on Wall Street at about 20 basis points for 8 years. You can look at a chart. It's like a big soup bowl. And it goes down at the time of the crisis from a reasonable rate to 20 basis points, stays there for 8 years, and now it's shot back up to 220. In other words, just in less than a year, the front end of the curve has started to lift as the Fed has taken its foot off the neck of the money market. And just add that together, and you're going to have one huge yield shock in the bond market, and that will ricochet into the entire financial system because remember, the 10-year bond yield, which has been kept so artificially low, is the benchmark that drives the entire financial system. Every other kind of security is priced off from that, including other governments around the world, including investment-grade U.S. corporates, and then from there to lesser grades and to junk and so forth. Everything prices off the 10-year. And the cost of debt, of course, drives the level of price level of risk assets, equities, and the others, because the cheaper the debt, the more you can leverage risk asset positions and thereby drive up the price. Anyway, I think this whole thing is coming to a big conflagration, and it would have happened anyway, but the silver lining of Donald Trump is that the Fed is filled full of all kinds of proper establishmentarians, and they're not about to be pushed around by this wild man, interloper, uncouth liar, as the establishment press wants you to believe, and is mainly correct. And so they're going to dig in. They're going to dig in and do what they think their Keynesian lights are telling them to do, which is to keep ratcheting up rates and keep shrinking their balance sheet until some furniture breaks all over the floor of Wall Street, and then it'll be too late. And that, in combination with the massive expansion of the fiscal requirements, is really finally going to bring the system to some kind of crashing halt. Now, what that means is if you happen to be an investor, I wouldn't be anywhere near Wall Street, the bond, or the stock market, at least for the next couple years, because there truly is going to be a monumental collision. And you will have, I will tell you, a government that is totally non-functional. Now, that's my last point. We all celebrate our Madisonian democracy. In other words, the Founding Fathers were skeptical enough about the temptations of political power that they designed a mousetrap that basically couldn't work. So many checks and balances and two houses and vetoes and so forth and so on. Normally, that's a wonderful thing. It's the one structural feature of our democracy that keeps the Leviathan from getting as enormous as it is in socialist Europe. But we are now imposed a runaway fiscal train on the system that cannot be stopped unless somebody cuts spending through a majority act of both houses that then has to be signed, or reforms entitlements in the same way, or, God forbid, raises taxes in the same way. What I'm telling you is the welfare state is so out of control, the warfare state is now so dug in, and we're so exposed everywhere around the world that there is not a snowball's chance of getting a majority in Congress to act to stop the fiscal freight train. It's left the station. It's out of control. We're going into $2 trillion plus deficits that will smash up against a Federal Reserve that's finally decided to stop monetizing the debt. That's really what QT is. They finally decided they've done such a wonderful job that they don't have to engage in financial fraud after 30 years and continue to monetize the debt. That will create the mother of all yield shocks. That will send the market into a tailspin that can't be retrieved, because unlike 2008, when George Bush was sitting there and dazed and suddenly got convinced that to save the free market he would suspend the free market, or you remember his famous phrase, if we don't do something, this sucker is going down. Well, what's happening this time is that the sucker is going down, and the political system is in such bad shape. It's so frayed. It is caught up in such intense, nasty partisan warfare that this spectacle going on right now on TV, as we're all sitting here, is emblematic of that. When the crunch comes, when it's September 2008 again, there's going to be no unified response. They will not be able to put it together. I think we've had the last bailout, and then suddenly all that's built up over the last 30 years, this massive debt, government that's expanded everywhere, a warfare state in a foreign policy that we can't afford, a central bank that is basically destroyed honest free market capitalism in the financial system, which is the heart of capitalist prosperity. All of this will finally be exposed. Now, my last point is, where does that lead us? And my answer is, I do not know. But at least it is better than what would have been the case had Hillary been elected, and we would have continued to drift down the road of more and more debt, a Fed that thinks it needs to run the world, a foreign policy that was failing by the day. I think at least all of that is going to come to a grinding halt, and maybe there'll be a chance for some gigantic re-education of the American public and the American electorate when they see what a mess the political class in Washington and the deep state that they serve has finally brought all of this to. So those are some comments that took a little longer than I thought, but I hope that was useful. Thank you.
I was always perplexed why there wasn't hyperinflation or more inflation after all the quantitative easing.
Yeah.
And I'm still perplexed by that because, inflation is just printing money.
Yeah.
And so if you have any comments
Yeah.
on that, I appreciate it.
Oh, that's a great question, and actually I write about it almost every day in my blog. And the thing is, when we say hyperinflation, we think of Germany, 1923. But if you look at 1923, the price level in the United States was flat. It was inflation in one country because they massively expanded their currency, but people had alternatives, and there was an enormous flight from the D-mark at the time into anything else, gold, the pounds, guilders, etc. And that's what caused the whole thing to soar. We're in a different world where the money printing has been global, it's been planet-wide, and as the Fed printed all this money, it didn't cause inflation because it created excess balances in our accounts with the rest of the world. But rather than do what good old Milton Friedman thought, he's the one that basically convinced Nixon to shut the gold window and destroy Bretton Woods, he said, we'll have a free market in currency, and the exchange rates will be set on the free market, and that's what we should do. We don't need this rigid gold-based system. Well, he was in theory right, except there never was a free market in exchange rates. It was a dirty float from day one. And central banks everywhere decided that if there's too many dollars coming at us, they no longer had the option of going to the gold window for gold and turning in the dollars, that they would basically buy in the dollars through exchange rate interventions, stuff them in their central banks, and print their own currency in lieu thereof. And that's why, if you look at things, it's crazy. China had foreign exchange reserves of maybe $100 million in 1993 when they decided to go the capitalist route, and Mr. Deng said it's glorious to be rich and all that. And by the peak, they had $4 trillion. Well, in a natural world, in a free exchange market, nobody would build up $4 trillion worth of reserves. That's proof positive that they were intervening consistently, massively to buy in dollars. And so therefore, basically, the inflation never happened in the dollar economy, but it caused a bloating of the entire financial system of the world, which in places like China led to massive capital investment and shiny new factories and apartment buildings and infrastructure and high-speed rail and all the rest of it. But it was really a deflationary, and this is what I have to keep telling people, it was a deflationary phenomena on a global basis because it created so much capital investment, because capital and debt was cheap, and China is a house of cards, that enormous capacity to build things and dig things and construct things and ship things and so forth, enormous overcapacity, malinvestment was created, and that had an initial deflationary effect on the world. That's why manufactured goods today, the index price level is no higher than it was, say, in 1999 on a lot of things. So unfortunately, a lot of people on our side were making the wrong warning, looking in the wrong place. It still was massive monetary inflation, but it was global, and it led to deflation of goods and services, even as it caused an enormous inflation of financial assets. And so they were looking in the wrong place. They got discredited, or at least the establishment people, the mainstream media constantly beat you over the head. Where's the inflation? Where's the hyperinflation? And frankly, we said, or some of us anyway said, it's not going to be inflation in one country because everybody's doing it, and they're doing it to protect their export industries, and the whole world is going to be infected with this thing. And that's where we are today. Now, the reason this is important, this is my blog this morning. The reason this is important is that now that Trump has figured out that we did actually lose a large part of our productive economy, and the idea that we have, 530 billion of imports from China, we only export 130, that's not natural, that's crazy. In the old gold standard, that would have been cleared because we would have had a loss of gold, and interest rates would have gone up and deflation would have happened here and so forth. But there is no clearance mechanism in this world, and the Chinese just kept buying up our debt, and this crazy imbalance continued year after year and got worse and worse. Finally, Trump comes along, who's totally an ignoramus, utterly uneducated about anything economically, and especially about trade. I mean, he's been basically a 17th century mercantilist for his whole life and didn't know it. But he came along and said, I'm going to fix this. And the one thing a president can do in our system, unfortunately, is raise tariffs under phony Section 232 and 301 investigations. He doesn't need Congress to approve. I mean, we couldn't even repeal Obamacare because you couldn't get the votes on the margin. But suddenly, he's like the kid in the candy shop. He's discovered he has these authorities in year 2 of his administration, and now they're going nuts. I mean, we get so used to the news day after day, but the point is 250 billion of Chinese goods are already tariffed, and they've tariffed 110 billion of theirs, 85%, and it's now going to the next level. This is nuts. It's going to blow up the system, but most importantly, it's going to blow up the red Ponzi, as I call it. And it's the red Ponzi that is the ultimate answer to your question. That's where all of these excess dollars came to roost. And if you go to China, you can see it today in highways that nobody's on, and 65 million empty apartment units and so forth. That's where it all came to roost. And so I guess my final point on this is another silver lining of the Donald's unlikely arrival in the Oval Office and discovery of these trade authorities. He's going to blow up the red Ponzi. And that will be a good thing too, because it will force the whole world economy to start righting itself.
Hello. Actually, what you just commented on was kind of exactly what I was going to ask, and you made the exact points I wanted to hear. But I was going to ask you maybe a personal question you might not be able to answer, and that's on Alan Greenspan. I was wondering if you could answer what might be his personal motivations for what he did at the Federal Reserve. I was wondering if maybe, like, my personal idea is maybe that he's like Francisco de O'Connor in Atlas Shrugged, where he's kind of like a playboy that intentionally wanted to wreck the economy.
Well, actually, he was the opposite. It's a great analogy. But actually, Alan Greenspan was the nerd who could never get the girls, okay? You remember, he's a clarinet player, and he was kind of a bespectacled economist and so forth. And that's a little facetious, but what I'm saying is he craved adulation. I've known Greenspan my whole life, and he's not completely bad, just mostly, as it has turned out. But I knew him in the 70s when he was CEA director, and then when I became budget director and he was running his private advisory firm, I saw him all the time. He had decent ideas. But he wanted to be in the circle of power. He craved being needed and important and listened to. And as I started out early today, he, got appointed to that job because they wanted to desperately get rid of Volcker, and Reagan said, Ronald Reagan, of blessed memory, said, well, you got to get somebody better. And they didn't, because Greenspan basically had become a pragmatist and had walked away from his prior views long ago. But then when he became Fed chairman in the 1.5 months after he took power, there's a 23% decline in one day in the stock market. Some of you, a lot of you here I could see, remember it, but just think of what it would mean today. Let's say by the time we got done with this meeting, the stock market was down 6,000 points from where you came into this breakfast this morning. I happened to know that because I was giving a speech on October 19th, 1987, and I was in a room like this, and I'm kind of gassing away, talking about all these things, and it was before cell phones, but the next thing I knew, one by one, the people were getting up, and then there was a murmur in the crowd, and I'm talking faster, and I'm trying to get my point across. And by the time I got done, the room was half empty because the word was spreading that the market is crashing in a way that none of us can imagine today. So literally 6,000 points, and it happened in 2 or 3 hours. And so he stepped into the breach and quickly stabilized the system in some ways that I've written about at length in the Great Deformation that were not appropriate, but opened up the spigots and manhandled the Wall Street trading firms and investment banks to do business with each other, even if they knew the other side was a bad credit. But he stemmed the slide quickly, turned around the economy. Everybody thought he was a great hero, and that's the real answer. And he suddenly found all of this attention and all of this glorification so amenable that he spent the rest of his 19 years doing the same thing. And we got, remember, the Committee to Save the World and the cover of Time magazine with Greenspan and the other two standing there. So that's really what it was. And as we've always said, power corrupts. And that's kind of the bottom line that everybody should remember about what's so evil about the Federal Reserve. It's an unelected Politburo. And it creates people like Greenspan. It creates fanatics like Bernanke. He was nuts. It creates school marms like Janet Yellen. I mean, she was worse. And we'll see where Powell goes. But until we get, and Ron Paul has always been right about this, until we get the Fed corralled and defanged, if not abolished, I don't think we'll ever get there. But there's one reform that would save the whole thing. When it was created in 1914, there was not a FOMC. There was no open market committee. You could not own government debt, not a shred of it, not bills, not bonds, not notes. It was not legitimate. The Fed was only there to liquefy the banking system by buying real bills, which were, trade receivables or finished inventory. And if you went back to that role as a way station to solving the problem, abolish the FOMC, get them out of the government bond market, get them out of the business of interest rate pegging and GDP management and so forth, it would be a huge step in the right direction. But until we do that, you're going to have the Greenspan syndrome problem time after time in one form or another. So, one more question, and unfortunately I have to head out.
Do you still think Trump will resign or be impeached?
Yeah. Trump, he made like such a catastrophic mistake, and I wrote about this in my blog yesterday. He should have taken a page from Ronald Reagan's playbook. And Reagan came in, we inherited a mess, and he basically said, one, we're going to puncture the bubble quickly, early, so we can move on. And so he empowered Volcker to do everything that was necessary. That's what Trump should have done. He should have called Yellen in day one, January 20, you're fired. Put in an anti-Keynesian, like somebody like me or Ron Paul. That would have scared the hell out of the financial markets. There would have been a complete collapse of the bubble, and then we could have dug ourselves out. And secondly, Reagan never stopped blaming Jimmy Carter, even as the economy began to recover and turn up. It was this mess inherited from Jimmy Carter. Now, Trump has done he's such an egomaniac that he gets a couple of good economic numbers, which are kind of random. We don't even have to go into that. And he embraces the whole thing. And now the big, fat, ugly bubble is the Trump triumph in the stock market, in an economy that's really on its last legs in terms of the aging and tired business expansion, is the greatest economy ever or in modern times. So he's embraced the whole thing. And when this goes down, he will go down with it, because he's put his jaw right out there, his glass jaw right out there to be smashed hard by all the political opposition. And who's the opposition? It's not just the Democrats, it's all of Washington. It's most of the Republican Party, okay? And as a result of that, I think he will end up, because I believe the stock market will crash in the next year, and the Republicans will panic about 2020 and total loss of Congress after they lose the House in these November elections. And he will be put on what I call the Dick Nixon Memorial Helicopter to his final ride to Gainesville. So that's my thought for the day. Thank you.